Vank, it's Orson Welles. How are you doing? This is the part where you're supposed to say, oh, of course it is, because it's Monday nights, and we're here, because this is all that we do now, people. All that we do is sit in front of computer screens. There is no future. There is no hope, as it would be in the bleakness of David Fincher's world, people. Welcome back to the Talkin' TV podcast. We have 3 Talkin' TV episodes left in the year of 2020. I mean, well, look, we've already talked in tandem enough about like just everything that we've accomplished this year and everything that we've done. So the only thing that I'm going to say as far as to that goes is stay tuned. Keep coming back for more awesome content, which we will have for you guys. We've got a tremendous event that I put together. Okay, I'm not going to say I put it together last night, but I like pretty much finalized it last night that we're giving to you guys.
Yeah. It's going to be huge. And what I will say is, just so there's no confusion out there, when Dom says that there's only 3 episodes left, that's only for the Wednesday content, the podcast. We're still going to be coming at you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the next, what is it? We said 12 seasons, so there's 4 seasons
in a
left.
Short film. 12 seasons in a short film.
Just on the podcast, but of course, we're not even taking any time off in the January. As soon as January kicks,
we can't.
We're just going to keep going. So don't worry.
It's like that last week of December. I'm taking a little bit of a break, just a little bit of R&R because I desperately need it with the last couple months that I've had.
Of course, yeah.
But other than that, yeah. So Chris, let me ask you something.
Well, real quick, we got some people
in
the chat rolling in. Stranger Boy, what's going on, homie? How you doing? Hope you're having a good night.
So Chris, I have a question before we get started. What would you say your relationship is with classic Hollywood films? Because it's an area that I don't actually think has really ever been touched upon, at least while we've had this podcast. I think the closest we came was when we did our Once Upon a Time in Hollywood episode, but even then, that's more of a Tarantino experience. So what's your experience with classic Hollywood?
Yeah, I mean, I have the fortune of growing up with my grandparents in the household, so I've seen a lot of things. Oh, hey, man. To you as well. Thank you. Stranger Boy wishing us a merry, very early Christmas. Dude, appreciate that.
I actually came up with a great bit for that, but I'm going to save that for the end.
Love your little Christmas logo. But yeah, you know, I grew up and I feel like I was raised pretty worldly. Like, we went to Shakespeare every summer. We saw many plays down at Broadway and local theater plays. Like, I've seen Oklahoma. I've seen 42nd Street. You know, I grew up with like Fred Astaire, the Marx Brothers, Abbott and Costello, all those guys on the TV in my household. Like, I've always lived with 3 generations. And so I've seen a decent amount. The one area that I don't think I've seen the most of, because, you know, it was a little over my head and whatnot, was like film and dissecting movies. But still, even to that tune, went to film school. You know, they forced Citizen Kane down our throats, whether we liked it or not. I happen to like it. But so, you know, I feel like I have a lot of people in my life, both friends and family, who have helped to fuel the fire of my quest to constantly expand and grow as an artist.
Yeah, my relationship is weird because, like, black and white movies just in general were always the things. Obviously, yeah, I would watch it with the grandparents, but, like, they were always, like, very random. They weren't, like, kind of like a mainstream occurrence. It's so funny, for somebody as religiously obsessed with movies as I am, it's weird how, like, kind of in and out they've been in my actual life, just because it's probably because I am so obsessed. It's because my family just could have cared less for the most part throughout their lives. Like, they watched stuff, but they just, like, they didn't care. It wasn't really anything to them other than just watching stuff, which would explain, of course, why it's everything to me. So my whole thing with Citizen Kane is it has an effect really on any incoming film student, because it's like, okay, if you're going into film school, you have to have watched at least like 4 or 5 major films, like Citizen Kane, Do the Right Thing, Taxi Driver, and 2 more that I'm drawing a blank on. And Citizen Kane is a movie that you kind of take for granted when you watch it the first time. There's also like Battleship Potemkin
that they've shown.
That's the one. There you go. Yeah, and it's funny because when you watch it the first time, it's something you kind of take for granted, and you're like, okay, this is cool for a black and white movie, but I don't necessarily know if I get it. And I think the interest for me came from one of the first editing projects that I ever had to do was I had to make a short film comprised only of scenes from the movie.
Same.
And construct like kind of a through line through it. And somehow I did it. I think I can see, if I remember correctly, I could see like a spy story kind of sort of. I'm like, well, the guy's investigating, so I mean, it's actually really easy to take the interviews that he has with each individual person and make them into like a compilation that like leads up to something. But Obviously, it's safe to say Citizen Kane, one of the most well-known movies on the planet, obviously famously written, directed, produced by, and starring the great Orson Welles as Charles Foster Kane in his directorial debut. Again, the greatest directorial debut in film history. Just the idea that he was coming off of theater and was a relative outsider and basically wrote an entire movie about kind of like the really an ahead of its time movie about kind of the illusions of fame and grandeur and what that actually does to someone. And the problem with Citizen Kane is that there are so many different ideas to talk about within that movie that, like, I watched that movie again a couple nights ago and I'm like, okay, I just like there's too much here. I need like a month and to be not working in order to dissect it.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot. Like for a movie made in 1941, I'm like, shit. Like this is like I could watch this 100 times over and still
deep.
get something new out of it every single time. So needless to say, the other factor of this is the David Fincher equation of this formula that we're slowly building up to with our episode name, because David Fincher is a director that I have certainly gotten into in recent years, but is a director that has widely become known for his apathy just in general towards human beings, and it's part of the reason why his movies are so good. He's like a pinpoint precision with each specific shot in his movie, and is a little bit obsessed to the point where it's like there is not like an apple that's placed in a frame in his movies unless it was decided by him. He's that kind of a director.
Right.
And so after a 6-year hiatus from his last movie, Gone Girl, it was announced, obviously pre-COVID, that his next movie was going to be a movie about the co-writer of Citizen Kane, that being Herman J. Mankiewicz, a local Hollywood legend, and it was going to be shot in black and white. It was based off a script that his dad wrote way back in the day. And I was like, okay, this sounds cool. You know, this Fincher now taking his crack.
The late Jack Fincher.
Yeah, the late Jack Fincher. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. It's Fincher taking like the latest like Hollywood biopic. You know, Hollywood, specifically the Oscars, love jerking themselves off with movies about Hollywood.
Yeah.
And it's really sad. Literally, I'm actually going to read later on a list of like the 10 movies that like you make one of these movies guaranteed Oscar nominations. You know, we're getting into that season.
Sounds fun.
Obviously, the Oscars this year, like everything else, is fucked. But
well, the Oscars
really
were always fucked, and now they're just pushed back, so we have to deal with their nonsense even longer.
That is true. But if anything, it's funny because people think that the Oscars being fucked is a recent phenomenon. I'm actually going to show, because I have, again,
you've been explaining that to me a lot lately.
I have so many notes here that explain the Oscars have been fucked since the very beginning. And
can I just say one thing, though, real quick before we get too far away? Because you said something very interesting about Fincher himself. And so I've only seen 3 of his films. I've seen The Game, I've seen Social Network, and now I've seen Mank. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about the person. You know, obviously didn't have time to go and binge his filmography, although I really do plan on it. I've enjoyed everything I've seen from him so far. Spoiler alert, but I do have my criticisms of this film as well. But it's funny you said apathy, his apathy towards human beings. I feel like there is some of that, but I actually watched a really interesting video essay on Fincher from The Ringer, who, Dom, you put me onto, and I've been loving everything they do. And they raised a really interesting point. It's not really his apathy, it's more so his need to dominate the people in every situation. And I've only seen 3 of his films.
That is a big part of it.
But he really is, and if you know about anything about him on set, you know he makes people do extra takes. He really is like that classic director of we're not leaving here till we get it right. So I just wanted to, sweeten the pot for later on in this conversation real quick.
Well, see, it's funny that you mentioned all that, because like you mentioned extra takes. Like I don't think there's been a director since Kubrick that like tortures actors the way that he does. Like literally like the most like common thing that came out of Zodiac after that movie. Oh, it is a perfect movie, and that's why, because he directs it.
Yeah, I agree.
I think the one known knowledge about Zodiac is that Zodiac is kind of part of the reason why Downey and Ruffalo went with Marvel exclusively for their feature, because there were stories about he's got Downey on his feet doing 100 takes a day. Gyllenhaal was like visibly broken after that movie.
Wow.
Like Timberlake has also talked about like the ridiculous amount of take. Like the guy is obsessed, like to a fault. Like it's insane. Just like how into it that it goes. But so you brought up a lot of points that we're gonna hopefully get to if my mind can actually stay on point tonight. But so people were talking about Mank. That was a little bit of a longer like build up to our topic of tonight, longer than it usually is. But I think that it's warranted, because this is a movie that, to say the least, Chris, you famously knew. We watched it together. I fell asleep during a little bit of it because I was a little bit tired. I'm always tired now. I don't think there's a single day where I'm not tired, people. But But I watched it the first time, and I woke up after it was done, and I'm like, I don't know if I really get this. And Chris was like, well, you also fell asleep during a decent amount of the parts. I'm like, I know, but the part I did see most of it. And he was like, nah, you were right. You were right, though, because I went back and I watched it again the second day, and I'm like, okay, all the pieces are falling into place. So, again, as for where we start this conversation, again, we should probably start with its inception a little bit. Like I said, obviously, the film the film is loosely based on an essay that was written by film critic Pauline Kael for The New Yorker in 1942, shortly after the film came out. And it was basically kind of skewering of Welles himself in the sense of that kind of the idea is that it was kind of a well-known just fact about Kane after the movie came out that Welles, it seemed very personalized to Welles, but this essay obviously was, while just blatantly wrong, and a lot of its kind of points that it made was rather kind of, it definitely got a lot of people's attentions at the time. You know, for something to do that in 1941, that, you know, you have to make a big stink, which is the idea that Welles basically stole the entire idea and basically made it about himself, and the idea that it was really Mankiewicz's brainchild. And so the essay, along with another book entitled Raising Kane, which was just about the day-to-day process of making the movie, Fincher recommended the essay to his father, who was a screenwriter and had formerly worked in Hollywood in the 90s. He planned to make it, actually, ironically enough, right after the game. The movie was originally going to star Kevin Spacey and Jodie Foster. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And to be quite frank, I'm really happy that it didn't, because just imagining this movie coming out in the 90s is, especially with Spacey, obviously just with everything today, those implications is certainly just a scary thought to begin with. So, obviously, waits a couple of years, has a couple of, you know, obviously has a massive, tremendous amount of successes. His father passes away in 2003. Shortly thereafter, he makes the film Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which is, I would say, the only sentimental movie that he's ever made. So, obviously, after Social Network and Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, it was well known that he helped kick off kind of the Netflix renaissance that we're living in right now with his production House of Cards. He was the guy that really kind of jump-started the idea of, okay, TV, besides just being like these awesome dramas about these anti-heroes, can now be like as pinpoint and precise as a TV show. And it's funny because his style was so specific to House of Cards that it ended up inspiring like every single Netflix project that came afterwards. I'm actually kind of surprised that it took me this long to figure out, oh, that explains it. They're just trying to all mimic David Fincher style. It explains a lot. I mean, the man's a revolutionary, to say the least. But I think the thing that was the most interesting to me when he chose to do this was the fact that, okay, of all the people who seem to want to gravitate towards this type of a project, he's the last person that I would think of. Again, because Fincher is just one of those artists. Again, there's a reason why he's so well respected with kind of like, for lack of a better word, our circles, which is that he is one of the last people in Hollywood that is still able to play against the rules. He famously does not like working for studios. He calls all of his own shots.
He's got a bit of Orson Welles in him.
A little bit. But
in regards to, if you think about, like, he has this full autonomy over his projects, and with Netflix, you know, there's no studio interference. Orson Welles, obviously, that was a driving point of this thing. You know, who was Mank answering to? He was answering to Orson Welles and no one else. So you really got to see sort of, I guess, the villainy that they were trying to paint Orson Welles in his relationship with Mank in this. So I thought that was an interesting contrast, just kind of thinking about how he's making this movie about a movie where the creator had full creative control, and he is finally in a position, thanks to Netflix, to be in this. It's just funny how it lined up. I know he didn't make it.
The Netflix bashing is never going to stop.
No, I'm not bashing him. I'm not bashing him. I actually think it's a really cool thing that they like. Because, like, you know, did you watch Love, Sex, and Robots? I mean, that's like a very weird.
I watched 3 episodes of that, and I keep forgetting that he does
that's
that.
A weird.
Because, like, that's one of those.
That's a weird thing. Like, that doesn't come unless you have full autonomy and full creative control. It's like, basically what I'm saying is, it's funny how there's like, it's just that it lines up the way that the character in his movie is in the same situation as a director that he's currently in, and I think it's one of the only good things Netflix has ever done. So I got to give credit where credit's due.
Well, so it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think the first thing that I noticed, even when I started watching this movie during the parts that I watched the first time around, which is that this movie seems to be a presentation of his deeply jaded just relationship just with Hollywood in general, because it's famously well known that Fincher, again, worked for American Zoetrope and ILM coming up through the day, became like a very, very famous music video and commercial director throughout the 80s. He actually directed on the, funnily enough, the Janie's Got a Gun music video. He directed that. He's directed so many different things.
Michael Jackson he did some stuff with.
That too. His commercial filmography is ridiculously long. That it's funny when people think of his just regular filmography, they're like, still don't realize that he had such a long career before that. But it's famously well known that his first big project, that being Alien 3, was not a success at all. That project went through so many different filmmakers before it finally landed on his lap. The what's it called? The production obviously was a nightmare. A few of the actors tried to stand up for him, but it was just a matter of he was out of his element and on a movie that he just could not exude his full creative potential ability. And it's definitely a chip that he's carried with him ever since, despite the fact that, again, he went, and only 3 years after that movie, he made Seven, arguably one of the defining movies of the 90s. And then he makes The Game. And then he makes Fight Club. And how many douchey college bros talked about Fight Club like it was the movie. And then he makes Panic Room, which is a little bit of a step down. Then he makes Zodiac, arguably one of the best movies of the last decade, and kind of weirdly enough kicking off the serial killer genre. It's like his autonomy is so much that he almost goes out of his way to sabotage some of his own movies. You know, like Zodiac was a movie that they were priming for a fall 2006 Oscar campaign, and he was not ready to be done with the movie, and he ended up turning out a 3-hour movie that opens in March. And unfortunately, that movie was largely forgotten about up until recent years, which is insane, especially when you consider the 3 leads that it is in. But how does that all relate to this movie? Well, first off, the idea of the movie is that it's obviously the pitch is that, okay, it's about the making of Citizen Kane. And I'm like, cool. And then there's not a single minute of this movie where they're on set making Citizen Kane. And you're like, okay, what is this actually? And then you watch the movie the first time and you're like, okay, this seems to be just like a shot for shot, like kind of homage, for lack of a better word, to Citizen Kane. And you're like, okay. And then they're like, where is Orson Welles? Orson Welles is in like 3 scenes in this movie overall. And I think that's the reason why definitely a lot of people are going to think at first that this, like, again, it just seems like an homage to film history, you know, an homage to Citizen Kane, homage. That's going to be a word that's thrown around a lot. But the thing for me that really kind of made me understand it once I saw like every single frame of this the second time is that this, besides being kind of the most personal that Fincher has gotten in his entire career since Benjamin Button, besides the fact that this is clearly an homage to his father, it's also the sense of this kind of is the capitulation of everything that he's been working for since he started his career, if that makes any sense.
It kind of does. I mean, so basically what I'm getting out of that is it's, you know, I think it's, you're right. You hear a lot about all those things that it wasn't going into this film. You know, we thought it was going to be the making of the movie. We thought Orson Welles was going to be in it more. But I actually like how, because I watched this twice. I think I had to watch this twice to be able to talk about it respectfully for an hour. Yeah. You know, so I kind of, you know, there's, first of all, the way it's written, right? It goes in the Citizen Kane structure, which is a subtle, and if you know the movie well, then you pick up on that. We go from flashback, we go to the regular day, we go to flashback. So that's pretty odd. It's an obvious one, but then it gets layered and layered and layered, and there's all these isms of Citizen Kane in the film, but they're telling a completely different story. And it's kind of funny how the Citizen Kane aspect of the movie doesn't really come to the center of the film until that third act, where Orson Welles starts really putting the pressure on Mank. Really, this is, I don't want to say it's a biopic. It's kind of like,
not really. That's not the word I would use for this.
I forget what.
Would you say the term historical docudrama?
I would, because it's about a certain section of this guy's life. We don't, you know, we know he has kids, we never see them. He has this wife, we barely see her. So they really only let you know where he's at with his family at this point in his life. They really only let you know where he's at with his alcoholism at this point in his life. We have some flashbacks, but those really are only there to enrich where he is at this point in time. So to me, it's kind of, I don't know, it's like, you could tell it's Fincher doing everything that he wanted to do in regards to giving Mank his credit, which is what I feel this story is really trying to do, to show that, like, not that Orson Welles wasn't great, but, you know, it takes a team of people to make a film. And B, I think it does actually have a little more Citizen Kane in it than most people are saying. It's just not in the way that it was originally marketed, and I think that actually is a testament to how many layers Fincher tucked into this thing, and we can get into those and unpack those. But that's kind of what I got off of basically what you're saying.
What this movie is this movie is simultaneously an homage to old Hollywood, an origin story for Citizen Kane, and a biopic about Herman J. Mankiewicz. But in this case, a historical docudrama. More so in the line of, kind of, for lack of a better word, Love and Mercy, in that it's a movie that only shows you glimpses of two periods of a person's life. And obviously the the nonlinear format of this story, it is both in service to this story and in the service of Citizen Kane, because that's also the way in which Citizen Kane was told. And it's funny because I feel like if this were done by any other director, this would be regarded as self-indulgent. And it's funny because in a way this is really self-indulgent. But the funny thing is that in kind of using Citizen Kane as its base inception point as for how to generate the story, it kind of generates this whole new story just about that, again, just covers, like Citizen Kane, so many different things. Just the filmmaking process, the people who we perceive as being the true creators of the movies versus the people who actually call the shots. That sense of kind of that class system overall that exists in Hollywood. But it also has this incredible sense of this incredible carefree nature to it. You know, like Mank, even though he's so incredibly cynical and so disillusioned to the point where he's drunk through half the movie, to the point where he can't even stand or form coherent words or sentences, still kind of provides this kind of sense of glimmering hope, in the sense of he's surrounded by all of these, I believe autocrat is the word, but it's probably not. But the idea of just all of these people who are so set in their ways, and he's the only one that's providing any sort of like context. It's like, okay, are you actually hearing what you're saying? Are you hearing the words that are coming out of your mouth overall? And as reflected back at him in so many different characters, like the movie is like the movie truly is about like much more so about the inception from like the late 30s into the early 40s as far as just how Mank goes.
So real quick though, are you saying that he is sort of the reality to all these people who are so drunk on their own power that they're so I'd say intoxicated with themselves in regards to I forget Hearst's best friend, the CEO of MGM, the mayor, that character,
Louis B. Mayer.
Yeah,
Louis B. Mayer. Yeah,
you know, he's so in himself and into you know, Randolph Hearst, that when Mank is clearly spitting facts, although doing it in a very rude and brazen way, being really drunk, and in those days, really, that's a very unacceptable thing to do. You really don't roll up to someone's dinner party.
Unacceptable in the public eye.
Yeah.
In the public eye. In certain specific manners in which he was enacting it. But if you think that like every one of those guys like wasn't like drinking off to the side.
Oh, totally. I just think like it was very rude, and I think that was kind of outlandish for the times based off what I've seen and what I've read. And so I think like he is the court jester who, you know, he poked and he poked and he poked, and the king would love to kill him if only he could, but he can't.
Right.
You know, where back in the day, the king would kill the court jester who went too far. You know? That's
ironic that you bring that up, especially considering that Hearst is played by Charles Dance, Tywin Lannister himself, in this movie. But the idea of kind of Mank being this character that is cynical yet still charming and charismatic. He's just funny enough to keep around, but you don't want to keep him talking too long, because then he might actually start having people see kind of through your hypocrisy almost. And the idea of using Mank as kind of the hypocrite, the point of hypocrisy in this movie towards our views of Hollywood, seems to be, obviously, again, it's the focal point of this movie, but it seems to be kind of, again, like the source of this movie's metatextual nature, where the idea is that the idea that a lot of how a lot of these royalty figures are used kind of throughout the movie, as far as providing the inspirations for the characters in the movie. Obviously, it's very well known that when Mank and Wells wrote this, the character of Charles Foster Kane borrows heavily from William Randolph Hearst. Like, I went and read a brief biography after I was done with the movie, and I'm like, oh, wow, just beat for beat, everything. Came into a lot of money at a young age, bought a series of newspapers, basically controlled the narrative, ran for political office, lost it because of scandal. Obviously, we don't see that. Hearst is kind of used as this kind of larger-than-life figure that's looming over the entire film, but the inspiration is definitely there. And what I find so interesting is that the idea is that Mank is presented as the disillusioned insider, but ends up by the end, at least by the end of his overall narrative arc, being on the outs, which is part of the reason why Wells approaches him in the first place, because Wells obviously is an outsider, or at that point an interloper, trying to shake up the establishment. And Mank, he feels, is the perfect person to do that. And so I kind of wanted to get into this idea of, well, first off, I'm actually going to do something that I probably should have done at the beginning of this. I'm going to read you my review, because I wrote, I'm literally no joke, like yesterday I sat down and I'm like, okay, what is it that I can say just about this? And I kind of put just all my thoughts down, and I feel like this will sum it up. So bear with me here because it's a little bit. So
Sure.
Fincher is certainly not a director that I would ever consider to be particularly sentimental, which is why the idea of him directing a black and white period piece about old Hollywood seems so out of character. The story of Citizen Kane co-writer Herman J. Mankiewicz's life throughout late 30s and early 40s Hollywood, his struggles with alcoholism and gambling, his relationships with massive Hollywood figures Louis B. Mayer, William Randolph Hearst, and many others, and the sacrifice of his own career over writing what he considers to be the best thing he's ever written are all what is presented on the surface. However, what the film is about is so much more, almost to the point where it could be considered self-indulgent, like so many other incredible things released from the West Coast. I think the thing that immediately stands out here that sets this movie apart from so many others of its ilk is its blatant reprehension for the systems that play, both old and new, of Hollywood. Fincher's a man who almost didn't pursue a career in filmmaking after a disastrous debut feature film, and he's carried that chip on his shoulder ever since, resulting in some of the tightest and most pinpoint precise movies of the last 30 years. And while this film contains all of his signature trademarks, impeccable technicals, talent that knows exactly how to handle this material, a central character with an innate need/want for control in some aspect, it still stands out by being a crossroads of sorts as well as one of those little sum of my career movies. Within this one story, Fincher seeks to tell the other side of the most widely known populist film of the last 100 years of cinema, bring to life the landscape of the time, fill us in on all the character dynamics and politics at the time, and pay homage to Wells, Mank, and his father all in one movie. It's certainly a feat, but he pulls it off with ease. The man who kicked off the streaming trend of House of Cards, the streaming trend with House of Cards has come full circle. This movie is by no means perfect. It has its fair share of flaws. It's certainly questionable when it comes to Fincher's specific characterization of Wells, and the film, of course, contains artistic liberties, what historical biopic/docudrama doesn't. But what separates this from so many others of its kind is its ultimate disinterest in what makes those other types of movies so appealing to the voting body. Instead of embellishing and worshiping those systems, it seeks to break them down to its knees. Herman Mankiewicz is characterized as disillusioned, disinterested in reality, consistent in his beliefs that the inherent fantasy of Hollywood is a sham, and as a result takes out his frustrations on the page. It's funny, the first time I watched this film I was confused because the film at points seems to be pointing directly in Mank's favor, while at others making him out to be bigger than he was claiming. But after a second viewing, the pieces fall into place. This movie is Fincher's opus to his experience in Hollywood, his late father, and the greatest movie ever made all in one. But more than that, broken down to its knees, it's a movie about the death of creativity, not just in the film industry, but in the world in general. It's a perfect representation of 2020, and in my opinion, the best movie of this miserable, awful year. That last bit I got a little bit hyperbolic there.
Sure.
But
yeah.
I mean, hopefully that kind of sums up basically everything that like my exhausted brain is just trying to sum up, because I'll admit I have all my notes down and I'm completely butchering most of them.
No, that's there's a lot of stuff in there. The one thing that particularly stood out to me was the creativity line. I think that's something that a lot of generations feel, I believe. What can be created. We've already had the greatest stories of all time, yet people still, for some reason, have this quest to continue to create art. I always typically disagree with that, but I do think that you can say that maybe Mank feels this way, and maybe Orson feels that like creativity is sort of kind of coming to an end, and so that's why they're trying to shake things up. Like I feel like Orson Welles was very ahead of his time in the sense that, he was, I mean, who else defied the studio system back then? Who else was talented enough back then to defy the studio system and still get a movie made? I mean, this is the era of, like they say in the film, they say that, I forget, Paramount, Warner Brothers, whatever, one of them has the most contractually obligated stars, because that they used to back in the day. For those of you guys who don't know, a star would sign with the company. So, for example, Judy Garland would be with, like, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, but hypothetically, like MGM for 5 years, then she'd get contracted to somewhere else, sort of like record labels. So for him to just like be so avant-garde in this system and shake it up with a film like Citizen Kane, which is really just such a look on how I really feel like back then, if we want to add a little history in there. It's kind of like Randolph Hearst, he had other enterprises. So he owned the papers and he owned other enterprises. And so what that does is he's not going to write about his other businesses in a poor way. He's not going to allow that to be published. It was kind of a fundamental shift in our society where for a long time the press was independent and you weren't allowed to sort of own other businesses if you own the press. Like it was supposed to be, and I forget what president went in and changed that, but you can actually look this up. This is all historic, and it's around this time when that changed. So I think Orson Welles saw the writing on the walls, And I think that Citizen Kane is a really beautiful way to not only equate to how we feel nowadays about creativity being dead. I mean, we have so much schlock after schlock. Just look at the CW. I like some of it. I'm not trying to be that mean guy, but I'm just saying, like, so many people are obsessed with some really bad programming. But, like, the writing's been on the walls for a long time. And I think that for me personally, in regards to that, what you wrote down there, that statement, it kind of serves as, like, Fincher's refresher of, hey, like, we still awake? Because Orson Welles was before this all happened. And, you know, it's only getting worse, I feel, which I know he wanted to make this in the 90s, but I think there's, like you said, something to it coming out in 2020 on an even another level, you know?
Yeah. Obviously, just the technical aspects aside, the movie is very much operating under the sense that, yeah, creativity is dead, but has it just recently, or was it kind of always this way? Like, I think the reason why this feels so prevalent now is because it feels synonymous, kind of like Mank's frustrations feel like the frustrations of everyone in the sense of, but not just with creativity, just with people in general, and how just like everyone just seems to be kind of going along with the status quo. Nobody's questioning anything. Nobody's actually wanting to put in any form of critical thinking because they're all just kind of too obsessed with the positions where they're at right now. It's playing around with the idea of kind of the only way really to challenge something is be an outsider, but also be really lucky at a time when both of those things were very, very few and far between. But, and that's kind of where the self-indulgence angle comes in a little bit, because again, Fincher's a guy that's always prided himself on being very independent. He's a guy who always does whatever project that it is that he wants to do. That's why the list of projects that he turned down is almost as interesting as the amount of movies that he's directed. And the thing is that, oh shit, I had it and I completely lost it. The thing is
it's all good.
No, the thing is that his oh my god.
You good?
Right, let's move down. No, I completely lost it. I'm so mad at myself. Like, I don't know what happened. Like, I was just ready to go. Okay, now I think I remember it. So that's where the irony of this comes in. Is the sense of where he's a guy who always works in the studio system, but now he seems to be wanting to playing towards all of the things that he knows that Hollywood likes in these types of movies. You know, the historical docudrama, the movie about Hollywood. It's shot in black and white. But the difference that sets this movie apart from something like La La Land is the sense that La La Land only seems to be wanting to reinforce those structures that came before. And that's kind of in a weird way why I'm still not the biggest fan of La La Land. It feels like this really weird nostalgia piece. This movie, though, among many others, is deconstructing, but in the right way, in the sense of, okay, why did we ever worship this? Like, why do we have this fondness for this specific time? It's questioning kind of just like what it is, why it is that we keep coming back to these people who very clearly are just in it for money, kind of overall. And obviously, Mank's presentation through that and his decision to write Citizen Kane and the way in which the movie is incepted towards Citizen Kane, that all plays towards that, I think, in a very, very meaningful way.
Yeah, and, you know, I'm just looking stuff up right now, and prior to the 1930s, the newspapers were apolitical. They simply reported on, heinous acts on either side of the aisle, and it wasn't until they went privatized where, you know, big business owners could come in and own it and purchase other things. And so it's, like, so funny how, I don't know if maybe Mank did. Mank seemed very intelligent, very articulate. Again, my only exposure to Mank is from this film, and it could be a little romanticized for the sake of telling the movie, although this is a cut and dry film. But, like, regardless of even if they stayed too accurate to historically who this person was, someone saw the writing on the walls in regards to, I'm going to talk about that one scene where they're all at the dinner party, and it's William Randolph Hearst's having a party for the mayor at his house. And so they're all sort of hanging around. They're having this really beautiful scene where it's like almost like everyone has a different line, but the way that their group chemistry there, their dynamic there was technically so awesome. And they're sort of talking about, like, you know, the changing times and how, you know, Hearst is basically his whatever her name was, I forget her name,
Marion.
Yeah, Marion. She sort of blabs out that, hey, he was on the phone practically devising the cabinet. And that's when that change started to happen in our history of our country. And so, you know, Citizen Kane sort of shows that, like, this guy that everyone thinks is larger than life, right? He had 300 acres of property. He had a zoo bigger than most zoos in the country on his property. This man was a king. But was he a good guy? Everyone thought he was because he threw these lavish parties, and I think it speaks to the undertone of the time, Citizen Kane, and then this film comes out and talks about how all these things that people are complaining about right now have been going on unchecked for so long because Mank saw this, you know, and to me it's like, it's so funny how this could have come out in the 90s. You know, the political landscape was not as, I'd say, volatile as it is right now, but it's only gotten worse in regards to the corporate abuse and the manipulation of the media and all that. So it's just like perfect that this movie comes out in 2020 and says, it's not even like they tried to say this. It's just that this is a part of this character's gripe, at least what I understood, because he's a very well-rounded and articulate man. So just to let everyone know, I did look it up. It's in 1930 when newspapers became privatized and they stopped being apolitical. And so I really got that out of it when I was reading and did some research on it.
I find it interesting that the primary source for this screenplay, when Fincher originally presented it to his father, was Pauline Kael's famous New Yorker essay. When this movie is both at the same time doing what that essay did, while at the same time it's not, because that essay existed only for it's available. You can go in and read it. It's an interesting piece to read, even though it is completely wrong, literally to the point where a lot of Wells' friends and supporters, including famous director Peter Bogdanovich, who was a Wellsite, he basically worshipped at the feet of Wells, basically came out and stated how wrong she was. And obviously the actual history, the way that it goes, is that Mank wrote the initial 100-page draft before it was taken over by Wells, who largely took the script and then just improv'd upon it and basically, put his own, work on it, as collaborations happen in Hollywood. They were a lot fewer and far between back then, and that one, it was kind of existing outside of a lot of the modern-day regulations that happen. Obviously, the WGA they mentioned in the movie is just becoming a thing. Yeah. Like the union rules overall, they just didn't exist overall. So the idea of that collaboration, to me, the source of that feud just comes from the idea that a lot of the structures that would prevent something like that from happening had not been invented yet. Mm-hmm. But the idea of this movie's treatment towards Citizen Kane, I think, was a lot more overhyped than what it actually meant to be. Because what this movie comes down to at the end of the day is it is trying to, I think, have this metatextual nature that allows it to be hyperbolic about today's events, while at the same time kind of pursuing this deconstructionist angle of the past, which inevitably leads to the present. And what I mean by that is kind of the election subplot that happens in the movie, which was something that I was a little bit distracted by the first time I watched it, because I didn't really get how it tied into everything. And then the second time I watched it, I understood, okay, no. This is supposed to show, obviously, the influence that these people had on election. And the fact that regardless of Upton Sinclair's ideas, which, again, I wasn't even aware that Upton Sinclair, the only thing I knew him for was for the books that he read that we were told about in history class. Yeah. And the effects that these guys had on the election, regardless of his actual policies. Again, he dared to go outside the status quo. So as a result, he was labeled a socialist and a communist, like everyone else. And Mank obviously was kind of forced to play a part in that regardless. And then we saw, like, the figurehead that Mayer and Hearst had elected is, again, he's like, what are his policies? Who cares? As long as we got the wrong guy out, And the idea of this movie is also playing around with something that Spike Lee played around with a couple of years ago in Black Klansman, the idea of the manipulation through media. I think one of my favorite lines in the movie is when somebody says, Mayer states, well, what do you know? When you show someone the truth enough times, they start to believe it. And Mank responds with, or I think what you mean to say is when you flash something in somebody's face loud enough times, they start to believe it.
Right.
And I absolutely love that
line. And they paint that picture throughout it so much when they're on the beach, right? Mank and his wife having a rare moment together, actually, in the course of the film. And the radio comes on and he's like, wait, I know that voice. That's an actress. And so it's so sad that this has been going on for so long, but hey, maybe this is what we need. I hope people see this film, and I hope they actually dig as deep as we are into it right now, because the same things that are happening right now that everyone's complaining on, left, right, doesn't matter. Everyone's complaining. They seemed to be happening back then. And I don't think it was, I don't think the metatextual subtext of this was the intent of this film, though. I just think it came out in this social climate, and so it offers yet another layer. But I actually don't think that was Fincher's intent to put that on the precipice of it. Clearly it's there. I think he's obviously not blind. He knows it's there. I think it's more about a character story and sort of, traversing demons and whatnot. That's really what I felt the movie was more so trying to say. But it's so apparent and in your face, and it really does pair up nicely with the times. To me, that's how I got out of it.
That's just a matter of like kind of, again, just the movie's presentation of its themes and the setting. Like those things are going to be inevitable as to how they pop up in it, you know? I think that Fincher, again, obviously Fincher feels very strongly about these, or at least his dad did when he wrote this, but obviously it's very well known that the script was polished by famous Hollywood screenwriter Eric Roth before it was published. But I wanted to go with two quotes, one of which is from Citizen Kane and one of which is from this movie that I feel like kind of sum up, you know, both those movies within one stroke. So the quote from Citizen Kane is the line that the reporter Thompson states to the rest of the people when they're going through Wells's junk at the end of that, or sorry, Kane's junk at the end of that movie when they're asking him about Rosebud and if he found out anything about it, and he's like, I don't think a word can explain anything in a man's life, just another jigsaw piece. Kind of the idea that the whole pursuit of that movie was to try and figure out one last thing that would give the newspapers like the scoop on this one man, when in reality, like it seemed like they pretty much knew his entire life story. Like everything that he found out was stuff that like he already kind of knew about. And the idea of Rosebud, regardless of the knowledge of what it actually meant, it wouldn't have made a difference as far as the person of Charles Foster Kane versus the character that they were trying to portray him out to be. He was already a larger-than-life character. The quote from Mank is when Mank is talking about the idea of just feature films and what they're becoming. Obviously, this film also covers a period of time in which silent films were transitioning into speaking films, even though silent films were still primarily all over the place, which is that you can't capture a man's life in 2 hours. You can only hope to get the impression of one, which is a statement that I find really interesting considering just how much people have obviously gravitated towards television now. What's it called? And one of the things that I hear a lot from people on the internet who talk about it is, oh, the thing I love about television is you can spend so much more time with these characters, right? But that's always been the magic of film, right? The idea that you get this snapshot into a person. You don't get the full picture, but because you get enough of an impression, you're allowed to speculate as to what the other characteristics are. And this film, I think, is trying to say that is still possible, but at the same time, it's not, you know? Because this idea that we're so inundated with information now, it's almost like we don't really have and another thing that I think that this film is trying to play around with subtextually is this idea that we almost don't really have a conscious choice anymore, whether we even realize or care to realize it or not.
Yeah, no, and I think that line, it certainly did speak to me as well, resonate with me from the film. I know it's not, but it to me, it's almost a fourth wall break of Fincher sort of like sneaking one in and speaking directly to the audience there. I mean, it's just so true to me, the heart of this film, and to the character of Mank that we get to meet as well. So, and you know, I think it's, you can have different things, you know, like there's something to be said about getting 22 episodes with the character, and then there's something to be said about having this beautiful little snapshot that we get with Mank in this film. You know, it depends on what you're going for and how well it's executed. So I think both are acceptable, and in this case, I wouldn't have it any other way. I really enjoyed this film, so.
Yeah. Well, the last thing that I wanted to talk about really before we kind of got into final statements and rankings is the Marion subplot. Because I think that was kind of the piece that I was missing when I made my initial critique on the movie, which is that obviously the character, it's the character of Marianne Davies. She's introduced as being Hearst's mistress, and her relationship with Mank, the way that it's introduced is this kind of very platonic, but this also very flirty relationship that, again, I feel like only could have existed in this time and place. And besides the fact that I think Amanda Seyfried gives the best performance of her life in this role, she's truly spectacular, jaw-dropping. I think that in addition to I hope that she wins the Best Supporting Actress Oscar because I think that she more than deserves it. And the reason why I say that that's probably the most important subplot of the movie, besides all the stuff that's happening with the Citizen Kane and the writing of it that's taking place in like the present day, is that it helps inform on Mank without giving us all the answers, which I feel like is a good way to bounce off of the kind of the frame, the snapshot, the idea of filming a snapshot of a person's life beforehand, which is, I feel like a lesser writer would have made it out that Mank was in love with Marion and of course ended up writing Kane to spite Hearst because he had the one woman that he was never able to get to. That's the more traditionalist screenplay, right? That's the more obvious choice, right? And it definitely makes this a lot more simple and less complex, right? That's the easy choice to go with. But it's really the opposite if you actually think about it, because Mank, the whole thing about Mank is that would completely go against the idea of who Mank is as a person. Mank as a person is somebody who despises power. He despises power. He despises systems. In general, he despises systems that prop up said power, right? I think the biggest misnomer about communism is this idea that communism wants everything to be equal. I don't necessarily believe that it does, just based on what I understand about Karl Marx as a person. It just wants to root itself in the idea that people cannot be in a position to take that power that gives them that unjust advantage over other people, at least just from my terminology. So the idea of Mank kind of not really having any ill will towards Hearst is a fascinating one, because just based on merely what he represents, as far as the whole idea, again, of what makes Hearst such like kind of a looming presence, is the idea that even though he's barely in the movie, he has such this strong presence that makes you aware, okay, this guy is calling the shots. Even when you get a guy like Mayer, who is very, very much, again, in charge of the studio. Again, he has that big Ari Gold moment where he walks through the hallways with Mank and his brother, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, another very famous, writer/director portrayed by Ozark's Tom Pelphrey. And he's giving them that long speech about the Metro-Goldwyn Mayer family and the things that makes him passionate about film. And then at the end of the day, you just see him as being Hearst's number 2. And he's just another suck-up, just like everybody else. He's got Arliss Howard. It's so funny. Arliss Howard is that actor that I see pop up in like a few things here and there. And I'm like, oh, okay. He's in this and he's fucking awesome. He was in Lost World and he was awesome in that. He's in True Blood. He's awesome in that. He's been in a dozen other things. But this idea that, what's it called? But back to Mank and Marion, the idea that he truly does consider Marion as a friend first and foremost. Like, I really do love the scene where they're just walking through Hearst's garden, kind of enjoying that carefree Hollywood lifestyle. It's a moment that is just really sweet and innocent and says a lot without saying a lot. It's one of my favorite just types of these moments in movies. And it's this idea that it plays off of the fact that, again, it gets into the personal angle, which is the fact that, yes, he does regard her as a friend, and yes, he is very aware of the fact that he's married, but it's the fact that he knows he can never have her. And it's the fact that, of course, that's going to inspire his creative impulses, and it's going to inspire his worst creative impulses. He's already a character/person who plays off of his just worst impulses in general. So, but how that continues further is the idea of, in his writing of Hearst with the Charles Foster Kane character, I find it so fascinating that he doesn't portray Kane in any malicious way, because throughout the entirety of Citizen Kane, Charles Foster Kane is never once presented as a malicious personality. He's presented as definitely big in his britches, definitely kind of, has this slow fall where he starts off as this very idealistic figure that ends up kind of using his own power to kind of dominate the narrative, which is the very thing that he was fighting against in the beginning. So he becomes kind of a contradictory character by the end, but he's most certainly never a malicious presence. He's always presented as this very sympathetic character,
up,
which I find very interesting. What up, Jay?
No, yeah, and there's one thing I want to chime in with. That scene in the garden, I mean, if you know your history, and it's a pretty easy historical fact to understand that the 30s are the time of the Great Depression, but I mean, when they're walking in the garden and she's like, I hate to complain because look how good I have it, look how good we have it, but people are people and they're going to complain even at the best of their the best of their living. And that relationship between Kane and what was her name again? Marion.
Marion.
To me she was super important to, like you said, sort of, because she painted the side of him where, he's an interesting kind of guy. Like, I know that he wasn't 100% on board with the capitalistic approach of the day, but I also don't know if he was quite 100% on board with the whole Upton Sinclair socialistic movement either. I think he, the whole time, felt that people were too quickly to dig their heels in and draw their party line or their stance on one side of the aisle or another, and I think it really frustrated him. And so I think having all of these people, and I guess that they are females, but he never gets sexual with them or intimate with them, because I think he has like a respect, but I just think that he needs outlets and he finds comfort in the women around him. But I just think he's so complicated, and I think that he sees things from so many different angles. And while he does sort of the court jester speak, and people assume that he doesn't really think when he speaks, he just makes these witty sort of in the wind comments. I think everything he actually says is super calculated and super planned out and poised. And so I think that's like interesting, the way that she informs his character. You know, those conversations that walk through the maze, that the zoo that she has with him. You really, even though she's speaking the majority of it and he's sort of rebuttaling, in his rebuttals and in the conversation they're having in the first place, that's where I really feel like I learned a lot about who this character was. And especially since it comes towards the end of the first act, arguably maybe the start of the second, whatever, you know, early in the film. I think that like scenes like that are scenes that make the ending payoff of where this character eventually goes worth it for me, and makes me, I had to think a lot to really enjoy this film, but that's okay because I feel like you should think, you know? Sorry, I just wanted to chime in before we got too far away from that specific sequence you were talking about, because I also had some important things in there that I have painted my view of the film from that moment.
No, definitely. And again, I like the idea that you use that word think, obviously, because again, it's a well-known fact that 99.9% of movies that are released now could care less about whether you think. They just want to put their point forward, if any, and again, and kind of just compete with the overall surge of blockbusters. And this idea that this movie has, again, just with the amount that it's juggling overall, just everything that Fincher is trying to say, everything that Fincher is trying to pay homage to as far as this goes, it's a different type of a movie. And again, I feel like I say this with every movie now, but it's a movie that I wasn't expecting in the year of 2020. And kind of to wrap it up, I guess just as far as what I actually think about the movie, because, I mean, this movie contained a lot, but I think the thing that made me stand out so much is when I watched it the second time, again, brilliant technicals. I mean, like to talk about the technicals of David Fincher's movies is boring because they're all so well done. Like, to put this in perspective, when I was finished with this movie, I put it as number one for pretty much everything in my own personal nominations. I have Gary Oldman and Amanda Seyfried lead in their categories. I have Fincher at one for directing. I have his dad at number one for screenplay. This has cinematography, editing, hair and makeup, costume design, production design, sound. It's a
by the way, remember
movie.
We said we thought they shot it on film? I actually looked it up. They shot it in
They shot it in
8K, but what they did was they decompressed the footage so that it had this grain that wasn't an ISO grain or a digital grain. It was still not an organic grain, but they were also able to use the practical effects through it of the day because that they have now, like, for example, green screening the background of the car because they shot it in digital. But that was so, I don't know how they made it look like it was film. Like, it blew my mind when I read that. But
yeah, no, it's wow.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
That
we're talking about the
so
technicals,
many questions
you know?
now.
Peace
No,
out, stranger
definitely,
boy.
because we weren't sure when we were watching it. Then I pointed out, I'm like, no, there's grain on the top of the screen. They clearly shot this on film.
Phenomenal.
And they did. So that's really good to know. But again, obviously, it's just satisfying to have a good movie. And it's nice to have a movie that makes you think. And it's nice to have a movie that actually is about something, which so few movies seem to want to be about now. And if they do want to be about something, they want to be about something very surface level and very easy. And the idea that Fincher is able to make this movie, which so many different things about this scream Oscar bait, and the fact that he's been able to make it so original and so very much his. I also like kind of the sense that this is very much a writer's movie, in that the writers are usually the one sect of Hollywood that always feel the most undermined, the most manipulated, the least in control. And that was all over this movie, where the part of the reason why Mank is playing the court jester role at the end is because that's what he feels he is relegated to. He is the guy, like so many others in Hollywood, that is just there to state what the current agenda is, make it seem funny and relatable, and then just shut up. And for a movie to be about all of that and more, that is why this movie is unfortunately not a 5, unlike Citizen Kane, because I don't know if I'm ever going to get a 5-star movie ever again, to be completely frank. But it is definitely a 4.5 out of 5. It's my absolute favorite movie of the year so far. I'm so glad I watched it a second time. Just, oh man, I'm really sad that we can't go 2 hours, but frankly, my brain is going to leak out of my ears if I do that. So,
hey man, no, listen, I think we actually offered, and not to toot our own horn too much, but like I always do, make my own opinion first, write it down, lock it in a box.
Definitely a different
but
perspective.
I've listened to a lot on this just to fill my gaps with Fincher, get some of the history there that, we weren't alive in that era. And let's all be honest, the public schools don't go nearly as in depth as they should. I feel like we offered so much more than anyone else has on this topic. And I actually really, really enjoyed this episode. Not that I love doing our show, but this was really fun. And I do have to say, man, I think that this movie, while it has some surface level layers, really, it's a thinking man's game in a sense. Like, if you don't want to like put your, your collegiate hat on and sit down and dissect this, then it's not the movie for you, which I know alienates a lot of people. I know a lot of people that I've spoken to. Some of my friends are like, hey man, I think I'm going to pass on this one. And if I pass on it, I might not cover it on the channel just because, it's not really my cup of tea. And I don't want to really have to do that. And I get it. I totally get it. But I also think getting this film is something that I don't think I fully got every layer of yet. And I think that's awesome because I can't wait to rewatch this one again in like a few months. Just because of, like you said, all the metatextual aspects and the fact that even in this conversation, the things you got out of it that I didn't even get still apply. Like, there's so many things in this film: the social context, the human interaction, the battle with alcoholism and creativity, and this mastermind being trapped by an addiction we didn't even really tackle, but that's another layer, which I really haven't seen done in the way that they did in Mank. And it's not a perfect film, though. I'd say it's also a 4.5 because I think as someone who critiques things now, and we've been doing this for a while, I think audience acceptability is a factor, and I don't think it's as accessible to as many people as. Unfortunately, I think that's unfortunately a sign of the times. I think that's where we are. I feel a few weeks back I brought up the statistic of the human attention span, says Microsoft in a study in 2012, is 8 seconds, and it was 20 seconds in the year 2000. So from 2000 to 2020, we've gone down 12 seconds. That's so sad. But I am glad that a film like this is finding a market. But again, like, it was a lot of homework. It was a lot of thinking, a lot to unpack. So, and some of it still, though,
it's not something that you want to ask of the common everyday moviegoer. Again, they just want to sit down with their nachos after a long day of work and just turn their brain off and relax.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's a few different headspaces you have to be in. And I I'm thankful I was in good headspaces both of the times I watched it. But it's kind of like another Irishman, except the Irishman, the only real tackle there was that it was long. It wasn't as deep. It wasn't as deep with the way it interweaves the history. Sorry to be so long-winded there, by the way. My bad.
It's a little bit of a misnomer about that movie, only because that movie is incredibly deep. I think the difference is that the surface is something that's a lot more appealing to a lot of other people, because it's always easier. It's always easier to sell a movie about gangsters than it is to sell a movie about old Hollywood.
And they even say that in this film. They're like, how many Americans even know a gangster? Like, it even speaks to that level. So
I just love the one line where it's like, oh, nothing but gangster movies, who watches that crap? And that just made me chuckle. I'm like, oh, that's funny.
But yeah, funny. 4.5. Sorry to be so long-winded. It's just, this movie's a mouthful to talk about. What can I say?
Yeah. So real quick, before we headed out of here, I mentioned at the top of this, that's called bringing it back around, bringing back a previous point that you referenced, a good rule of thumb when it comes to screenwriting and building tension. The 10 movie types that if you make one of these movies, you are guaranteed to get an Oscar nomination of some kind. And part of the reason why we hate the Oscars so much. Costume dramas, literary adaptations, stage musical adaptations, historical docudramas, biopics, It's Their Time Oscars, gifted person / entertainer, disabled person, white savior, and an actor's display. Those are the 10 types of movies that you make one of those types of movies, you'll release it in the late November to December window, you're guaranteed to get nominated for an Oscar. So I hope that covers pretty much everything as far as just like, oh, why do the Oscars suck? Well, the last point that'll bring up is that Citizen Kane obviously is famously well known for losing out Best Picture, Director, and Actor, and the only thing that it famously won, ironically enough, was Best Original Screenplay, with both Wells and Mankiewicz sharing the co-credit. Yeah. So, with that being said, I feel like that's a perfect point to wrap up. People, thank you once again for tuning into another episode of the Talking TV podcast. Again, 3 weeks left in the year after this week.
Crazy.
Still cannot believe it. That's absolutely insane. Just when I look back at the amount that we've accomplished in this second season alone, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, man.
So thank you. Just in general, that's the first thing that I have to say. You guys know what to do. Click that little subscribe button below this video. We put up so much new content. We've been putting up content 3 times a week. It's slowly killing me, but I love doing it so much because I love giving you guys all of this content. It's something that I've wanted to do for so long, and it's so nice to actually see it pay off overall. You get notified of all this new content if you click the little bell next to that subscribe button. If you leave a comment, that way we'll know some ideas as to what we can do next.
Yeah, let us know what you want us to do. That's a good... Yeah, we're open-minded.
Yeah. definitely a good rule of thumb to have. I also would really like if you just, leave the video a like. I don't know how that ranks in YouTube's algorithm, but I feel like that's important. Helps, definitely. And again, we have 2 episodes left of our Mandalorian rewatch series, so definitely tune into those on Fridays at 8 p.m. So,
and audio platforms as well, guys.
Audio podcast. Yes, thank you for reminding me. We actually do put up the audio for this.
Every
we
week.
Still do that. Those are on Spotify and Apple Podcasts on Wednesday mornings. Those go up. So basically, whenever you wake up on Wednesday, it'll be there. Listen to it in your car on the
Apple
way to work.
Podcast,
Listen
Stitcher, Google Play, Pocket Cast, Radio Public. You know all the places.
Didn't they add more?
They did. I don't know what they are. One of them we're actually doing pretty well on, too. We should probably get that one down. I'll look it up. We'll have it next week, guys. But point being, we're out there.
I had to throw this up.
What's up, Ken? Good to see you, man. Yeah, we are.
Yes,
hey,
you
man.
are. Yes, you
Thanks for hanging
are.
anyways, though. We appreciate it, brother.
Yes, always. Love it. I love it. Has the machine become self-aware there? I think it has. I think it has.
Same.
That's all I'm going to say. So people, follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram at Talkin' TV Podcast right there. You can see it right there. We'll see you guys on Friday and next week. And again, stay tuned for all of our surprises. And in this case, study your film history, people, and watch more fucking movies. We out.